I'm not able to see that once again.
Yeah, it's coming up, and in a
I can see now.
minute,
Yes,
just give it half a minute more.
yeah. I can read. So Suniti, you would be sort of moderating.
Yeah, because Karthik
Yes,
is
Sunil
not
will be
here
reading
today.
today. Ashok, you can start by reading the 7 realities. Yeah, Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Ashok, you have the discourses book. You can read from the 7 realities from that.
Yeah, no, I can see now. Avatar Meher Baba ki Jai. The 7 realities: existence, love, sacrifice, renunciation, knowledge. I give no importance to creed, dogma, caste, or the performance of religious ceremonies and rites, but to the understanding of the following. The only real existence is that of the one and only God, who is the self in every finite self. The only real love is the love for this infinity, God, which arouses an intense longing to see, know, and become one with its truth, God. The only real sacrifice is that in which, in pursuance of this love, all things, body, mind, position, welfare, and even life itself are sacrificed. The only real renunciation is that which abandons, even in the midst of worldly duties, all selfish thoughts and desires. The only real knowledge is the knowledge that God is the inner dweller in good people and in so called bad, in saint and in so called sinner. The knowledge requires you to help all equally as circumstances demand, without expectation of reward, when compelled to take part in a dispute, to act without the slightest trace of enmity or hatred, to try to make others happy with brotherly or sisterly feeling for each one, and to harm no one in thought, word, or deed, not even those who harm you. The only real control is the discipline of the senses to abstain from indulgence in low desires, which alone ensures absolute purity of character. The only real surrender is that in which poise is undisturbed by any adverse circumstance, and the individual, amidst every kind of hardship, is resigned with perfect calm to the will of God. Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai.
Jai Baba. Thank you, Ashok ji. And
So,
let's.
uh, just as context, we had a question yesterday from the reading, that's on chapter 1, about the dropping of the body of the Matsu. And Kama could not answer yesterday and wanted to take that up first thing today. So we'll start with that and then we start reading chapter 2, part 2, after Kama's discussion, Kama's response. All right, over to you, Smita.
All right, so I will start with God speaks in reference to the question that Kama had yesterday. This is supplement, page 254.
Kama, do you want to first respond and try to answer and then we can read the supplement?
Sure, Jai Baba. Okay.
Jai Baba.
So what we are seeing, yeah, Jai Baba. So we have read that about the Madzu sustaining, why the bhaktas or devotees of the Madzu provide sustenance for his physical body, which keeps on functioning automatically, and by their link with it, the devotees derive much spiritual benefit. So the way to look at it is that from a top-down approach, we know that uh, the first thing that individual drop soul experiences is fana. That is, all drop souls will experience fana, which is nirvana, which is absorption in bliss. Uh, that is super consciousness state, the divine absolute vacuum state, but not the God is state, because God is Satchitananda, infinite knowledge, power, infinite power, knowledge, and bliss. That is the second stage of fana. So a few destined souls will go from Fana, real Fana, first stage, to second stage of real Fana, which is called Fana Phila or Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Now, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, as we know, is the Satchitananda state, and the souls that achieve Satchitananda, there are subcategories to that. If you exclude the 56 God realized souls, and we know in the table in 278 in 56 God realized souls, it is divided into Majzubs, Paramahamsa, Jivan Mukta, and Sadguru. We also know that Majzubs are only in God consciousness state. That is absorption in divinity. Divinity implies all three, Satchitananda. Paramahamsa, so Nirvikalpa Samadhi is experienced by both Paramahamsa and Majzub, whereas the Jivan Mukta and the Sadguru are experiencing Sahaja Samadhi. So we call, there are subtle differences, as we know, because each of the four categories have different functions. Majzub is only God consciousness. Paramahamsa is alternating between God consciousness and creation consciousness, which is also called Nirvikalpa Samadhi, divinity in expression. And then you have the Jivan Mukta, who is simultaneously in both states, but is passive in his dealing with the public, which is called divinity in action, Sahaja Samadhi. And the Sadgurus, the five perfect masters, are actively participating with the public and simultaneously in both states, God consciousness, creation consciousness, and actively participating with the public. So it is called Atma Pratishtapana and so on. So coming back to the Majzub, what is happening is that if you look at Meher Baba himself, when he first got kissed by Babajan in 1913, till the time he was hit by the stone by Upasani Maharaj, he was in the God consciousness state and he was in a zombie state. Remember that he had to be fed and so on. And so that is an analogy of coming down to creation consciousness, which is basically the Majzub is becoming Jivan Paramahamsa and then probably Jivan Mukta. So who becomes what, we don't know. Now coming back to the Majzubs, we also know that after self-realization or God realization, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, most souls drop their bodies, which means they are not embodied anymore. They are disembodied. They go to state 2B, the eternal avataric infinite consciousness. When you're in the body, you are in state 2C, right? So the Majzubs, what happens is that according to this particular paragraph, because of his connection with his bhaktas or devotees, and to help them in their own spiritual journey, the Majzub keeps the body, or the body is kept for the Majzub, even though it's, the analogy I can use is like a coma patient. You know, a coma patient, basically, if you don't feed that patient is going to die. But the coma patient is alive and is being sustained. It's just an analogy of how we can look at this particular explanation. So that is why it says that all this activity of the body is completely automatic and involves no conscious interest on the part of the Majzub. After the purpose of the sanskaric link formed by the bhaktas to the physical form of the Majzub has been fulfilled, the body of the Majzub ceases functioning and is dropped. When the body of one who has arrived at unlimited truth is automatically dropped at the end of 4 days, or is dropped after its link to the devotees has been fulfilled, the event can be properly termed neither death nor a journey. So interestingly, here it says dropped at the end of 4 days. This is what happens to most people who become God realized and who are not part of the functional spiritual hierarchy of the 56 God realized souls. They drop their body. Or you have a case out here, the Majzub will drop after its link to the devotees has been fulfilled. So then when we go to God Speaks, we have on page number 256, which describes the spiritual hierarchy of the 7,000 advanced spiritual aspirants, including perfect masters. And if you look at that table on that page 256, interestingly good way to remember the page number 56, God realized souls to 256. So in the 7,000 uh, uh, spiritual hierarchy, from the first plane to the seventh plane, there are, as you see, the last two perfect masters are 5 and 3 are majzups in the seventh plane. And the avatar in the 11th age of each cycle brings the number to 7,001. Then it says there are always at all times and in all ages 56 God realized souls or Shiva Atmas in human form on earth. And out of these 56, only 8 have public recognition and function as active members of the functional spiritual hierarchy, consisting of 7,000 members who do the assigned spiritual duties on various planes of consciousness according to their spiritual advancement or perfection. So interestingly, in the 7,000, that is a separate number. And then you have the 56 God realized souls. From the 56, 8 have public recognition, which is 5 plus 3, 5 perfect masters and 3 madzups. These 8 are included in the 7,000. But the 48 remaining are not. They are separate. The remaining 48 God realized ones are not amongst the functional spiritual hierarchy of 7,000 members. They remain aloof and people are not cognizant of their divinity, though all 48 have the same experience and enjoy the same divine state of I am God as the other 8. These 48 are, as it were, on the waiting list, ready to help in any spiritual contingency cropping up through one or more of the functioning members dropping the body. So which means that what are the functioning members? So he's talking about probably the 8 active public recognition people, which is 5 perfect masters and 3 madzups. So if any one of those drop their bodies, so one of the 48 will then come and replace that. Now, out of the 8 God realized souls who are at the head of the functional spiritual hierarchy of 7,000 members, 5 are perfect masters who, besides having wide public recognition, have a duty to perform in the rendering of spiritual service and benefit to the whole of mankind. The remaining 3 are madzups who, in spite of having achieved godhood and remaining in the physical body, have no spiritual duty to perform towards mankind. Yet they are the source of spiritual benefit to all who come into contact with them. So it could be said that whereas the 5 perfect masters render spiritual service to humanity as a whole, the few who come into contact with and serve the 3 madzups draw spiritual benefit from them, while the 48 God realized ones keep aloof from recognition and function until a gap is created in the functioning hierarchy by one or more of the 8 God realized ones dropping the physical body. So what we can gain from this is that the 3 madzups who are part of the 5 plus 3, 8 active functioning people, of course, they don't participate. I think these are the same people that are being referred to what we read in Listen Humanity, the Bhaktas or devotees. Jai Baba. Any comments, any questions?
We can directly go to part 2 then. I mean, chapter 2. Unless there are questions or comments.
Sunil, you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. I was reading all this while.
Start from the beginning, please.
Yeah, just give me a minute.
I thought it was my audio.
I'm so
Thanks,
sorry.
Kava. No
I
problem.
went down deep down the page. Sorry. We're on chapter 2, cycle of sleep and walking. To sleep is to surrender to one of the primary forces of life. Sleep is an inescapable need. There can be no substitute for it. Although adjustment within certain degrees to its demands is possible, such as choosing 11 o'clock instead of 10 for retiring. Such adjustments can be made only within well-defined limits. There can be no tampering with the strict requirements for the sleep over any considerable length of time. For the average man, prolonged abstention from sleep inevitably results in bodily disorder as well as impairments or even derangement of the mind. The mind loses its normal alertness and deteriorates markedly in its ability to concentrate and work out abstruse problems. Further, it loses its ability to cope with the problems presented by everyday life. Sleep, being one of the most significant phenomena in the existence of the individual, must be truly understood if the purpose of life itself is to be fully comprehended. Any attempt to give an explanation of sleep in purely physiological terms will be incomplete and misleading as well. Many people consider sleep to be the inevitable result of exhaustion of the higher nerve centers of the brain. Some attribute the cause of sleep to the accumulation of metabolic and other deterioration products in the brain. Others regard sleep as the product of inhibition of higher brain centers by nerve impulses generated in specialized sleep centers. Still, other authorities regard sleep as natural condition of the brain, and they consider consciousness to be the result of activating the brain through external stimuli. Sleep, in their opinion, is therefore a relapse into the natural state of brain which occurs on withdrawal of these external stimuli. The essence of all these physiological explanations is that sleep is a byproduct of the physical brain. This is a radically wrong conclusion. A more profound interpretation is required to do justice to the real status of consciousness and its relation to the body and soul. Throughout evolution, consciousness is developed in and through the mind and expressed through the evolving medium of physical form. But consciousness itself resides in the soul. The body is only the medium through which consciousness expresses itself. Through the ages of a single life impulse, individualized soul gradually becomes more conscious as it expresses itself through a myriad of forms. The consciousness thus developed is the possession of the mind, and it does not vanish with the disappearance of the physical vehicle. The physical form also evolves as consciousness unfolds. Bodily forms emerge one after another in consciousness in continuous and ascending order so that total consciousness might develop progressively through a fitting progression of form vehicles. Consciousness is not a coincidental product of physiological process, but the very reason for the existence of all forms. Consciousness is the standard by which distinctions between sleep and waking should be understood. In wakefulness, the mind becomes conscious and expresses itself through the body. In sleep, the mind relapses into quiescent state of the soul and outer expression. Physiologically, the states of sleep and waking may be described as the retarding and accelerating of higher brain centers, but they are more significantly defined as submerging and emerging of consciousness. In order to answer the basic question of why consciousness should oscillate between the quiescent state of sleep and active state of wakefulness, one must attack the problem from primary origin of consciousness. Before the beginning of all beginnings, the infinite ocean of God was completely self-forgetful. The utter and unrelieved oblivion of the self-forgetful infinite ocean of God in the beyond state was broken in order that God should consciously know his own fullness of divinity. It was the sole purpose that consciousness proceeded to evolve. Consciousness itself was latent in the beyond state of God. Also latent in this same beyond state of God was the original whim, leher, to become conscious. It was this original whim which brought latent consciousness into manifestation form within brackets for the first time. Slowly and tediously, consciousness approaches its apex in the human form, which is the goal of the evolutionary process, and thereby an individual mind gradually differentiates itself from the sea of oblivion. However, the conscious individual still does not comprehend the truth of real self. On the contrary, there is produced in man a false sense of limitation and frustration. The full consciousness that is laboriously produced in the evolutionary process and that takes place of utter forgetfulness remains finite because it is replete and countless impressions, brackets sanskaras, of fulfilled and unfulfilled desires that have been acquired while inhabiting in many finite bodies. Originally, it was the leher that caused consciousness to manifest. In everyday life, it is the impressions, sanskaras within bracket, that cause latent consciousness in the sleep state to manifest itself as active consciousness in the awake state. Although the sea of oblivion has been swept back through the development of consciousness, yet it has been exchanged for a growing nightmare of ever-increasing futility. Forgetfulness has been displaced by remembrance, but it is a remembrance charged with limitation, helplessness, and binding desires. The full but finite human consciousness struggles to find self-expression and self-gratification, but even these efforts are subject to the sanskaric compulsion. They prevent man from recapturing the original truth of his being and subject to increasing limitation and helplessness. He is like spider caught in the web of his own making. As a means of respite, consciousness seeks oblivion of deep sleep, where it again surrenders itself temporarily to the sea of forgetfulness, the original beyond state of God. In the sound sleep, consciousness becomes latent for the time being until the burden of unspent sanskaras forces it to manifest again in the awake state. In his desperate attempts during wakefulness to overcome his feeling of helplessness and boredom, man may attempt to escape from himself through the exciting emotions of lust or anger. Although drowning oneself in lust or anger may seem to promise escape, the satisfaction achieved is only temporary. Inevitably, a strong countersense of remorse or depression is induced that is worse than original state of frustration. On the collective level, wars provide the exciting avenue of escape that subsequently reacts to numb the spirit of man with an overwhelming sense of burden. Nature has striven to evolve consciousness through long ages of painful struggle. It is a great tragedy that when consciousness faces an acute need to free itself from entanglement, it should regress instead of resorting to deadening of sensibility. This expedient is disastrous because it involves a conscious attempt to undo the achievements of natural evolution. I didn't very well understand the last one. Can I just read the para once again? Nature has striven to evolve consciousness through long ages of painful struggle. It is a great tragedy that when consciousness faces an acute need to free itself from entanglement, it should regress instead by resorting to the deadening of sensibility. This expedient is disastrous because it involves a conscious attempt to undo the achievements of natural evolution. Kama, any explanation for this? Or anybody else?
Sunil, if I may just share my thoughts.
Yeah.
I think, see, what they are mentioning is that in the process of evolution from the gaseous state to the human being, we are all acquiring a lot of, uh, you know, impressions. Hello?
Yes, yes. Go ahead, please.
And instead of getting disentangled from the impressions, we try to uh, uh, resort to deadening of sensibility, which means I think use of alcohol and drugs to sort of, you know, instead of dealing with the day-to-day problems and the impressions, we try to escape. It's a form of escapism, and so that is going against the natural evolution process of squaring off your sanskaras. This is my 2 cents. Happy to listen to others and Kama, of
Oh,
course.
okay. I see. You're thinking it's referring to the drugs.
No, I mean, I'm saying acquiring the sanskaras or impressions is inevitable. So the natural, it says they are natural sanskaras till the time you become a human being. And once you become a human being, you have a choice and you have both natural and unnatural sanskaras. And uh, instead of getting entangled, we are resorting to the deadening of sensibility. I think the deadening of sensibility would mean, I think what I thought, but if I may be corrected, I'm open to getting corrected as well. Jai
Right.
Baba.
Jai Baba. Any other thoughts about this deadening of sensibility?
Kama or anybody else?
Yeah, Jay Baba. I mean, the which particular paragraph is this given?
Page
The
119. Page 119,
okay.
second
No, no,
paragraph.
I
Second
see
para.
nature has striven to evolve consciousness through long ages of painful struggle. It's a great tragedy. Then consciousness faces an acute need to free itself from entanglement. It should regress instead by resorting to the deadening of sensibility. Yes, I mean, it is again Maya. I think everywhere when we look at the waking state, Maya is playing its role in the background. So the line, it is a great tragedy, then consciousness faces an acute need to free itself from entanglement. So everybody wants to be happy, correct? But if we don't have the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom, we look for short term solutions. And as we know in our current civilization and in past also, that people look for short term solutions like taking drugs or having alcohol or having gluttony eating. So I think this is what it means, the deadening of sensibility. The physical senses are being the one is the coarse desires, which is basically touch and taste. and one is through sex, and one is through food, which is taste. And then you have the finer desires. You can try to get involved in traveling all the time, the sight part, or listening to music, sound part. And you can go to botanical garden and smell the flowers, but that's not going to free you from your real journey of uh, self actualization. So it should this expedient is disastrous because it involves a conscious attempt to undo the achievements of natural evolution. Of course, natural evolution, up till the human state, we have no control. As Ashok said, we are all taking organic sanskaras and natural sanskaras. But then, human state, we have full and complete consciousness. So you have this what you call as free will or power of choice. And none of man's waking attempts to overcome his feeling of intolerable weariness is wholly acceptable to the soul. All are dissatisfying in the long run, and hence man seeks rest and refreshment by withdrawing temporarily into the oblivion of deep sleep. The idea that sleep is not just for rest for the physical body, but it has got a much more metaphysical aspect, because that is when in sound sleep state, as per God speaks, the Atma connects with the Paramatma and we are unconscious of it, and we experience bliss the moment we wake up, that we have this beautiful sound sleep state. So,
Right.
so that's how I look at this. Jay Baba, thank you.
Yeah, clear. Thank you. Thanks. Have to clarify. Thank you, Ashok. None of man's waking attempts to overcome his feeling of intolerable weariness is wholly acceptable to the soul. All are dissatisfying in the long run. Hence, man seeks rest and refreshment by withdrawing temporarily into the oblivion of deep sleep. This physiological necessity of sleep cannot be avoided. Just as a physical body requires alternating periods of activity and rest, so the mind also needs such periods. Sleep is the means by which mind withdraws temporarily from the pressure exerted by its age-old load of impressions and desires. Through sleep, the mind refreshes itself temporarily for further participation in the game of becoming self-conscious. If the self were completely aware of its true God nature during the waking consciousness, it would find no need to withdraw into the self-forgetfulness of sleep. Its spontaneous joy would be eternal wellspring of divine refreshment. When a man seeks freedom from the ennui of the waking state by losing consciousness in the sleep state, no slightest destruction of consciousness occurs. During sleep is an inward withdrawal of consciousness into a condition of temporary oblivion. In this state, the mind is completely quiescent. It does not experience the helplessness of finite self-consciousness, nor is it aware of the true self as the illimitable truth. Both the finite illusory world and real infinite state are forgotten as consciousness sinks into the sea of oblivion. In deep sleep, consciousness exists merely as a latent possibility which must again be aroused to activity. I have a question coming to my mind. Would Baba sleep? I believe yes. And what was happening to his consciousness during sleep state? Or, or if not Baba, let's say Sadgurus or any of the higher souls. Anyone?
Jay Baba, it's a very good question. I think it's been discussed before that all God realized souls, including avatars, Sadgurus, and so on, basically, once you attain self realization, there is no duality between the waking state and the sleep state. So, as you just read earlier, sleep is required. One is for the physical body, wants to take rest when it's very active. It goes through this active, rest and activity. And the mind also needs rest. That is why the aspect of sleep. So the God realized people, because their sanskaras are zero, they have no mind, they have what you call as universal mind. They are not caught up in duality, number one. So when they go to sleep, they are consciously awake, in the sense that it is only the body is taking rest. So, for example, when Baba's Mandali were doing night duty, you had to be very still, as we have read about Baba's life. But many instances when the Mandali used to move either for certain, whatever reasons at that particular moment, Baba would wake up and clap, and say, "Why did you move?" Baba would be snoring actually, and everybody, naturally will say like this person is in deep sleep. But no, the difference between an ordinary man in deep sleep state and a self-realized being in sleep state is completely different. As ordinary man in sound sleep is unconscious of himself, whereas the God realized being is conscious all the time because he is dwelling in super consciousness. So that is the difference. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. Okay, I will continue. Sleep stands in the same relationship to the consciousness as death does to life. Death is not the annihilation of life, but its transference to another state of being. In the same way, sleep is not the annihilation of consciousness, but its withdrawal into a state of abeyance. Whether latent as unconsciousness or manifested as consciousness, consciousness is always there. The matter may be summarized as follows. After going to sleep, when man ordinarily enters the ordinary dream state, A, he has no consciousness of the body. B, the link with the physical body remains intact. C, pain and pleasure are experienced for a short period. D, the man wakes up in the same physical body after physical death. The man also enters the dream state and A, he has no consciousness of the body. B, the link with the physical body is snapped for good. C, because the link with the gross or no longer exists, he experiences pain or pleasure, the states of heaven and hell, far more intensely, whether for a long or short period. D, he wakes up in the gross in another physical body. Very beautiful analogy. The passage from sleep to wakefulness consists in the passage from A, unconsciousness, to B, subconsciousness, and finally to C, full consciousness. Normally, for the ordinary man, these consist of sound sleep, A, sound sleep, which is equal to unconsciousness, B, dreams, which is equal to subconsciousness of duality, C, roused from sleep, which is equal to full consciousness of duality. When a man almost loses consciousness, as in high fever, he is subconscious as in the dream state. But if he is rendered unconscious through the drugs such as chloroform, he is unconscious as in the sound sleep state. Unconsciousness always involves temporary return to the original, beyond state of God, regardless of the cause, whether it be sound sleep, drugs, or a physical accident. Although the subject of the path and its disciplines is considered in detail later, it is of interest to note in this connection that for those on the path, the three states are A, beyond state of God, which is equal to unconsciousness. B, experiences on the path, which is equal to real subconsciousness of duality. C, roused from an ill illusion of duality, which is equal to real full consciousness of God or self. Mind seeks the abeyance of its consciousness in deep sleep, but it cannot continue indefinitely to accept this self-refutation. This negative achievement is not an adequate substitute for the final purpose for which consciousness came into existence. That is, for the soul to become fully conscious of itself as the infinite truth. Though man attempts to sleep through sleep to escape the burden of consciousness imposed upon him, he is involuntarily drawn back to his waking state by the impressions gathered in achieving of the very consciousness from which he sought escape. The old bonds of desire, both fulfilled and unfulfilled, bind him to the world of illusion and propel him again into the maelstrom of finite life. Although it is only temporary, sleep does give psychological reinvigoration to the mind. If there were some kind of restoration of psychic vitality during sleep, there would be no particular benefit to this oblivion. It should read, if there were not some kind of restoration of psychic vitality during the sleep, there would be no particular benefit to this oblivion. In spite of the apparent respite, consciousness would remain exactly as it had been at the time of its withdrawal into sleep, and no special gain would be achieved. It would be merely a fruitless interval in a long chain of automatic responses to the environment. Sleep does confer positive benefit due to the fact that the separate I consciousness is in complete abeyance during the deep sleep. The individual soul is in actual union with the infinite self. When sleep is dreamless, the individual soul is resting in the undisturbed tranquility of the most original beyond state of God. But inasmuch as sleep is submergence of consciousness into oblivion, it does not bestow upon the soul the conscious realization of truth that the soul will eventually experience when consciousness is freed from all impressions, good as well as bad. Even the unconscious contact with infinity, the abode of all bliss and power, gives to the mind a new tone and vigor. When consciousness returns to waking functioning, it manifests a renewed faith that at some time, in some manner, a final solution to life's complexities. Let me read this para again. Even this unconscious contact with infinity, the abode of all bliss and power, gives to the mind a new tone and vigor. When consciousness returns to waking functioning, it manifests a renewed faith that at some time, in some manner, a final solution to life's complexities will be found. Although the most important work of consciousness is always done during the waking state, dreams also play their part in helping consciousness through the maze of problems which beset it. As a rule, consciousness passes through the dream state during the transition from waking to sleep and while returning from sleep to waking. The dream state serves as a bridge between sleep and waking, but it is not an inevitable phase. The mind may swing between quiescence and waking without subconsciously passing through the dream phase. In the dream state, consciousness is not completely dormant as in sleep, nor is it fully active in the waking. The dream state is midway between those two phases and it marks a transition from latent consciousness to active consciousness. The unique virtue of the ordinary dream state is that experiences in it are relatively free from act of willing as well as from rigid social demands which prevail in the conscious life. Despite the seeming lawlessness in the dream state, it is nevertheless subject to the accumulated mental and emotional impressions, sanskaras, which function as inexorably in the dream state as in the waking. Many inclinations and desires which cannot find fulfillment in waking life seek and find gratification in self-created subjective world of dreams. Likewise, many fears and conflicts buried in the subconscious mind inflict upon dreamer a diversity of suffering, which the unconscious mind would seek to avoid. Thus, dreamland also invites the experiencing of the opposites. The unique characteristic of dream experiences is that they afford an opportunity to work out a number of sanskaric impressions without creating any new physical bondage. Many dreams have the same force and directive value that inhere in experiences of the waking state, but these latter are always accompanied by simultaneous creation of new emotional and mental impressions, sanskaras, that prove to be just as binding as age-old impressions that limit man's consciousness. Dream experiences, however, result in no such creation of further bindings. Another interesting aspect of ordinary dreams is that regardless of what the dream entails, it has no direct effect on any mind other than the dreamer. This is quite contrary to the experiences in the conscious waking state. These invariably involve and affect many other souls as well, thus complicating many life patterns. The activity of consciousness in the waking state creates a bondage of karmic liabilities and assets from which dream experiences are exempt. So I need some help here in explanation. Let's assume you are, yeah.
If I may just add, so this is actually when you are going to sleep and when you're going to deep sleep. Before that, you have a dream stage where you sort of uh, square off some of your sanskaras, the good and the bad. But when you're having a dream, you don't create any more new sanskaras. That means it is the stage where your sanskaric impressions are wiped off or reduced, but you don't create any fresh sanskaras. As opposed to the waking stage, when you try to deal with your karmic connections as well as sanskaras, whatever you do adds up to your asset and liability, or the plus and minus of sanskaras.
So
This
thanks.
Is that your question, or
Yes, my question is why. Explanation you summarized pretty well, I think. So I got it.
So,
but why
this is
dream
okay,
state doesn't create additional
So this
samskara?
is an avenue which Baba has given, or this later on they say it's a psychic experimental laboratory insulated from the demands of physical life and thus possessing some advantage over the waking stage. If you read the next paragraph,
I see. Okay.
it'll give an answer. But what I'm going to say is that it is a great avenue which the this whole process of involution has been given, that your sanskaric impressions are getting reduced, and that is why you can have some good dreams or something which you couldn't achieve in your normal life. It could be, say, for example, even be money. So supposing you are looking for wealth, or which you have not been able to achieve, you can think about wealth. Or if you had some bad, sometimes you have nightmares, something which probably went wrong in your worldly life, professional life, and you have nightmares which then reduce your impressions. The last two paragraphs are referring to that. Why you have it? This is an opportunity given by uh, by beloved God. And as contrasted to the when you die, you also pass through 3 or 4 days of heaven and hell. Even there, your sanskaric load and sanskaric impressions are reduced.
I
Jai
see.
Baba.
Yeah. Jai Baba. Kama, you were saying something?
Yeah, Jay Baba, I think that again from a top-down approach, all these three different states, waking state, and then in the sleep state you have two substates, which is the sound sleep state and the sleeping dream state. So we also know that when we have dreams during our sleep, it almost not almost, it looks like as if we are in the waking state. When you are going through the sleeping dream during a sleep state, the dreams that we have, it is equivalent to as if experiencing the waking state. And then when you wake up from the dream while sleeping, then we realize or awaken from the fact that my God, this is a dream. So if you extrapolate that to the waking state, we also know that all the masters have said this waking state is also a dream from which we need to wake up. Now, why we are not awakened from the waking state dream? Because we are attached to the material body, getting caught up in the physical body, gross body, subtle body, mental body, I, the false limited I, um, and also getting caught up in creation, which is the phenomenal world of duality of forms. So the waking state is also, you can say, of a higher degree kind of dream from which we are trying to wake up by understanding the laws of nature. So the whole process, if you look at the divine theme, in the divine theme, we are realizing that we are now basically a drop soul from state to A after the whim, having gone through this evolutionary consciousness, and now there is no more winding of sanskaras, but unwinding has to happen. But between the winding and unwinding, there is spending of sanskaras. So the spending of sanskaras can happen either in the waking state or during the dream state, because in the dream state, the subtle body is experiencing the dream, not the physical body. So, in a technical sense, why we dream is also, as Ashok said, there are certain sanskaras that get adjusted. And it's almost like when we eat something, we don't know how the body processes this. It's a natural state of the body because it's already programmed, what happens during digestion and all that. Similarly, I think that when we dream during our sleep, there is a reason for it. And Baba has said that it is the adjustment of sanskaras which sometimes are not possible during the waking state. So it is something we have to just surrender. That is why we have sometimes have nightmares or sometimes we have very pleasurable dreams. So I think it is all part of the process. And rather than asking why or what, we might just accept and surrender to it and say like, okay, this is part of the process. I have no control on it. But definitely one can say that the dream state, or I would say the quality of the sleep state of an individual in today's civilization is totally dependent on the quality of life in the waking state. So I always say that the quality of your life in your personal family life affects the quality of your life in your professional work life and vice versa. If that is not in harmony or equanimity, you are going to have bad sleep and in the process maybe bad dreams. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Kama really beautifully explained. But I just wanted to add that Hafiz is saying, which means that you know uh, we cannot understand many of the things which happen in our daily lives. I think that would be relevant here. Kama.
Yes, Jai Baba. Sorry, I was on mute. I think what you say is correct is that once you are a human being, the only goal is self-realization or self-love, all that stuff, the truth, God realization, and so on. And we are very lucky to have Baba as our guide, but it is almost like doing a PhD with a Nobel Prize winner, but you have to make the effort. And we are entangled in our sanskaras. We do have power of choice, free will to do intelligent action, but that also requires grace, because one interesting aspect that I've been pondering on is that without the grace of a perfect master, even an advanced spiritual aspirant in the sixth plane can't transition to the seventh plane. So when I've been listening to Nisargadatta Maharaj audio recordings, I think you guys should get it whenever you get a chance. If you're doing anything boring, you should listen to the Nisargadatta Maharaj talks, because it is an extension of Meher Baba's God Speaks, because it goes totally into the consciousness aspect, the Paratpar Parabrahma state, and all the challenges that we go through in our daily life. It is a very practical stuff that you will hear, which helps you to understand God Speaks, discourses, and so on much, much better. So this whole process, for me, what I'm seeing is that all human beings are God realized, but not behaving like God-like qualities. We all understand how we need to relate with people, both animate or inanimate, but we are not able to practice that on a daily basis, every waking moment. And this is the challenge. So I think this reading helps us to understand the technical aspects, but ultimately the provisional working ego, the love, obedience, surrender, sacrifice, and the how to love God is the only practical way, because not everybody is going to understand this concepts of sanskaras, waking dream, sleeping dream. That is for the intellect. 80% I think should focus on bhakti yoga, and 20% use bhakti yoga and jnana yoga to kind of emancipate themselves. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. So I continue. The dream world is a type of psychic experimental laboratory, insulated from the demands of physical life and thus possessing some advantage over the waking state. But because it does not give play to the directive faculty of the will and isolates the individual soul from other souls, it also suffers severe handicaps from which waking life is free. In spite of the periodic release and refreshment that deep sleep supplies, the mind continues to be dissatisfied, driven by the need to escape from the burden that infinite consciousness imposes upon him. Man associates himself with like-minded individuals. By merging himself in a group that has similar problems, he hopes to fortify himself against his growing sense of dissatisfaction. But this hope is ill-founded. He finds no more redemption by identifying himself with the false we than by identifying with the false I. The increased strength of the group is nullified by increased expectation. Instead of finding his powerlessness mitigated, the individual finds that it is merely shared by many others. His sense of helplessness is accentuated through participation in a group consciousness, for he shares their collective feeling of helplessness as well as his own. Although occasionally a man may be found to eliminate some one worry in life, the final solution to recurring problems remains to be found. Suppose, for example, that a man is extremely miserable because others in his office seem to be given better treatment than he. Then suppose he is suddenly relieved of all his worries by inducing himself in a studied indifference to his surroundings. This may give him a temporary feeling of release from his problems, but since the troubles are really caused by lack of understanding of himself and environment, his cultivated indifference really leaves the situation completely unchanged. Sooner or later, when his forced indifference cracks and he again becomes emotionally involved, his old worries return to disturb him as before. His attitude of detachment fails to effect a permanent change in his consciousness because it is not based upon the truth that there is but one infinite self, which is the self of all. To know oneself honestly and understand one's environment requires a radical change in outlook. Mechanical coercion of the mind into a temporary attitude is not sufficient, for the mind has a tendency to revert to its age old inclinations, habit patterns, sanskaric patterns, and to free itself from any position into which it may have been forced. Unless the mind achieves intelligent discrimination based on lasting values, it is inevitably harassed by its self created worries. Again and again, man must seek oblivion of sleep as necessary respite from participating in things of little satisfaction. Man clings to the palliative experiences of the gross world even though they augment the very worries, sufferings, and defeats from which his consciousness desires to escape. Only in extremity of despair does consciousness gather sufficient momentum to try to break through the constructing web of ego life and into the life of lasting freedom. When man realizes at last that his helplessness is the product of his countless cravings, he tries to find peace by renouncing those cravings and accepting life in a spirit of resignation to the divine will. Until that moment of supreme self determination occurs, however, he finds himself persistently haunted by an overpowering desire to perpetuate his self created ego life. Although he tries desperately to break through the self centered isolation his, that this life fosters, it is only when he surrenders to a perfect master that he is initiated sooner or later into the path of redemptive love. Oh, sorry, what did I do? Surrender to the will of the master is in itself very difficult, but it becomes more so under the gaze of friendly onlookers. To them, the action of spiritual aspirant often seems incomprehensible, as if he were sacrificing his most precious possession, his free will. Often it seems to the onlooker that the master aims only to increase his own prestige by directing actions of those who surround him. This falls far short of understanding the work of the master. Just as it is necessary for soldier to be influxed in a salt before it can join the two metal parts together, it is necessary for the soul of the seeker to be bathed through the self-surrenderance in the light of the master affords. The master gains nothing. It is not his purpose to gain. Certainly his ego cannot be exalted, for if he is a perfect master, he has already lost it. When a man determines to find peace and fulfillment through the renunciation of the cravings of ego life, he finds that his new decision is challenged more by the deep rooted compulsions of his own mind by any obstructive factors in the external environment than by any obstructive factors in the external environment. Although he now longs to love the Master wholeheartedly as the divine beloved, and tries to surrender completely to him, he is far from being master of his own mind. He cannot even surrender the things he regards as his own despite his sincere decision. Like Jana, the aspirant has two faces, one looking longingly at the truth and the other at ignorance. On the one hand, the aspirant yearns for the saving grace of the Master and to be completely lost in the unbounded truth that he senses in the Master. On the other hand, his false separative ego tries to perpetuate its existence by all available means. But with the first surrender to the Master, the death knell of the ego life is sounded, and though it continues to struggle for survival, its days of dominance are numbered. If a person is caught in a quagmire, he instinctively tries every means to get out of it, but the very effort he makes thrusts him deeper into it. The more he struggles, the further he sinks. Help must come to him then from someone who stands on the firm ground, and who can only be of help when the struggling man has ceased to struggle long enough to look about for aid. There is certainly certain similarity between the situation and the case of the individual who has surrendered his life to the Master. The false separative ego tries its utmost to postpone its own dissolution by resisting the divine love of the Master. It struggles in the quagmire of existence, but each act of ego affirmation invites a reaction of deep surrender to the beloved's will. This in turn brings with it the clearer realization of the Master as being none other than the irresistible truth that is self of all selves, and the one reality in the apparent multiplicity of individual souls. Truth realization is born of such complete surrender to the engulfing love of God, of which Master is the physical symbol and the channel. The finite self has now only recognized itself as hopelessly limited, but also as utterly false. It ceases to make any claims or to protest in its own right, offering itself instead to the infinite truth. The offering of purified will rebound to its own advantage. When infinite consciousness of the mind, in its stark awareness of futility and falseness, capitulates wholly to the infinite truth, the soul becomes conscious, one with that truth in self realization. Only then can consciousness be said really to have arrived at its final destination. Originally absorbed in the infinite, consciousness is now absorbed by the infinite, now consciously experiencing its own unlimited power, knowledge, bliss, and scope. In being absorbed by the infinite consciousness, is completely freed of one and all illusions and can be called superconsciousness, in which state its former unlimited helplessness is transmuted into unlimited power. The aim of life and the real goal of all creation is to achieve true self-consciousness. When the mind of man is transformed into superconsciousness of the soul, it inherits the treasure of omnipotence, and there is no recurrence of that sense of helplessness that has haunted his dreaming and waking states. No longer is there need for consciousness to be submerged into the oblivion of sleep in order to achieve unconscious union of the self with the universal self. the conscious union that the individual self has now established with the universal self is an unfading attainment that persists forever. In the unlimited abundance of superconsciousness, the freed soul experiences no curtailment or cessation. In superconsciousness, the soul experiences itself as almighty, its bliss is unbounded, and its continuous awareness of itself as infinite truth admits no slightest interruption by the self-forgetfulness of the ordinary sleep, dream, or wake state. Ordinary waking consciousness of the mind is not only incapable of realizing the true self, but is deluded to accept the false limited self and the false multiplicity of the phenomenal world as real. It is therefore a form of ignorance. Superconsciousness may be termed superwaking because this state has transcended all normal limitations and has become truly whole in the sense that it retains no element of illusion. It is the opposite of ordinary sleep, for oblivion of truth is complete in ordinary sleep, while awareness of truth is complete in superconsciousness. When waking consciousness invades and consciously illuminates the depths of forgetfulness, ignorance, and illusion, it becomes transmuted into supra-waking consciousness. We covered the chapter 2. Kama, would you like to summarize with additional comments?
Hey Baba. So is there a reference to the supra waking or supra consciousness anywhere else, Kama? In any other literature?
Very clearly. God just cannot be described in words easily.
Yeah, Jai Baba, I don't know. The supra consciousness, maybe Aurobindo talks about that aspect, the supra
Exactly.
But
But I have not come across in Baba literature, so I just want to check if there's any other place you've seen it. But of course, that's minor. So, any other discussions, or you want to break off a little early, given we may not want to start a new chapter at this time, given we have like 15 minutes?
Yeah, the group is also small today,
Yeah.
so it might make sense to stop early and get bigger cohort next time.
Jay Baba, I just have one observation, and which when I was reading the 7 realities and reading this chapter, so there is a real relevance of 7 realities and complete surrender to the. There are many paragraphs in this chapter which talk about complete surrender and the grace of God. So there is a correlation of what we read in the 7 realities and this chapter. Jay Baba. And also the supra consciousness is, I think, mentioned earlier in Listen Humanity only.
Really?
okay,
Super
Jai
conscious.
Baba,
Sorry, it's not supra conscious.
I slept through the class.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm joking. Because I read all of it till now, so I'm surprised I missed that. So I'll do a control find and check if it is there above.
I can only say that this is a very beautiful chapter. I read it 3-4 times. This and the other earlier chapter, Death and Immortality. They've got lots of.
The earlier chapter is just amazing. The earlier chapter is just unbelievable.
So much of takeaways and so many things to learn and imbibe and implement. Jai Baba.
Yeah, those two analogies I'll never forget, right? The number and the tug of war. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool then. So we'll wrap up a little earlier than normal, and let's catch up next weekend as always. Unless there's anything else anybody wants to jump in and talk about. Khalid bhai, anything from your side?
Jai Baba Kartik, Jai Baba everybody.
Jai Baba.
It's a beautiful
Jai
session,
Baba.
yeah. I'm spellbound, you know. So
Yes.
I'm still trying to absorb and retain. So no questions from me at the moment. Jai Baba.
Super.
Jai Baba.
All right. So with that, we'll wrap up and catch up next weekend, where
All
we
right.
start chapter 3, part 2.
Yes. And Karthik, maybe sometime when you're free, I'll wanted to have a chat with you differently offline. Yes.
So I think you called me and I called you back. You didn't pick up.
Yeah, no,
about
that's, we
20
got
minutes.
into
Yeah.
yeah. So,
No
are
problem.
you in the aircraft? Where are you? I mean,
No, I just landed. I'm
Landed,
getting
yeah.
to my meeting. Yeah.
okay. You carry on. Maybe whenever you're free, I'll have a chat.
Sure. Sounds good. Thank you. Jai Baba, everybody, and have a
Jai
great week
Baba.
ahead
Jai
and
Baba,
enjoy the
everybody.
Sunday. Bye.
Jai
Bye-bye.
Baba.
Jai Baba.
Bye.